reread Job chapters 1 and 2, but I figure that'll do. Just one clarification. We've come to respect Gene and Jim very greatly, or actually clarification is the right word, very greatly, and enjoy their contribution to our church and being part of the family. And as they share their testimony like that, you can see why. The clarification is that when Jean fell down the stairs and said her head was in a basket, it was attached. All I saw in my head was that basket that they have in a guillotine. You know, the head falls in there and the rest of you goes over here. It's all good. They did not have to reattach the head. Thank you, Jean, very, very much. Well, it just couldn't be a more fitting way to introduce this idea of Job again, and the problem of suffering. How do you deal with all of this difficulty? I was trying to come up with a way to introduce the idea of suffering, and Jean just did such a great job. On a much different note, I was thinking in terms of golf, because that's where my mind is in terms of this afternoon, and I thought back years ago to a story I've shared with you before. But it was a golf game many, many years ago that my brother-in-law felt like he was suffering. And my response to his suffering has formulated some of my ideas about suffering in a much more serious way. But he wasn't feeling well that day, and we had started early on a Saturday morning, my two brothers-in-law, my father-in-law, and myself. And he was golfing very, very poorly. Even by his standards, it wasn't good. And on the 10th tee box, which happens to be right by the parking lot, he hit his ball as poorly as he had all morning and had just simply had enough. And he took his driver and he went snap. And then he took the two pieces and he put them in his golf bag, put his golf bag on his shoulder and started walking to the parking lot and said, "Have a good day, boys." And he left. He had enough. My other brother-in-law, who has this very soft heart, said, "Man, I feel bad for him." It would have been wise for me at that point to shut up. We'll learn about that in Job as well. I, on the other hand, said, "Feel bad for him. He was such a whiny baby for the last 9 holes. I'm quite glad he went home. Now I can enjoy the rest of my day." And it brings out this idea of not only what it feels like to suffer, and when it comes to golf, I use that word very loosely, but how we respond to people suffering, and what it means to be in that moment. Jean has told us a story of being in that moment where you're not really sure that you want to continue living, in a sense. It would be better to be gone than to feel this way. And have you ever been in a similar situation, maybe not to that extent, and then a good, well-meaning friend has offered you some counsel that meant nothing to you? Because as you heard their words, you realized they had absolutely no idea what you were experiencing. Well, the story of Job certainly brings these kinds of questions to mind. And as we ponder this morning how to start walking through the problem of suffering, we'll find that there are some truths that we are going to have to incorporate into our thinking in order to deal and survive those moments with as much optimism as we can. The challenge of preaching this morning is, I encouraged some of you, at least that I have on my Sunday school group mailer, to spend a little bit of time reading the book of Job this week. The sermon this morning is going to come from 29 chapters. I don't think we're going to make the 1 o'clock tea time, because we're going to start reading those now. No. We just can't take the time to read 29 chapters. I hope that you will this week, if you haven't already, read Job chapters 3 through 31. The reason we can cover so much material in such a short amount of time is because though there are new ideas that get introduced along as you go, you find out that Job's three friends who are trying to counsel him in this time of terrible loss actually say exactly the same thing over and over and over again. They change how they say it. They change the tone in which they say it. At first they're compassionate and kind, not really, but at least soft in tone. And then they get angry and accusational, and then they start really throwing mud at Job and his family. But the content of what they're saying is the same. And largely, the way that Job responds is also the same. Ask Vanessa sometime about her feeling. You always grow past what you thought as a teenager, but she often has told the story that as a teenager, she got so angry when she would argue with her father because she would make a point which he would counter. And realizing she wasn't getting anywhere, she would come in from a different angle. And you know what his response was? Well, rightfully so, exactly the same thing that he said in the first place, just maybe in a different tone of voice. And he just kept saying the same thing over and over and over and over, and you couldn't move him even one iota of an inch. He just said the same thing, that was his position, and he wasn't going to budge. And Job and his friends are kind of in this position. So what we're going to do, I'm going to do something that I find a little bit difficult, is I'm going to try and just walk you through their conversation in part, and then at the end we'll just draw out some truths from that conversation. Just to get us on the same page, you will remember as we read Job chapters 1 and 2 last week, that God allowed Job to be tested. And there were two phases of this test. In the first test, he lost everything that had any value to him. He lost his farm, his wealth, his children, and their spouses. He lost everything. He had nothing of material value left after the first phase of this testing. It came through storms and tragic accidents and banding marauders that came and stole from him. He just lost everything. And at that point he said, well, God gave me everything. I guess God can also take it away. I came into this world with nothing. Now I have nothing. I have nothing to complain about. In the next phase of this test that God allowed to fall on him, he lost his physical health. He wasn't dead, but by many accounts, it would have been better had he been dead. He was in that much discomfort and illness with sores all over him, and he was weeping and mourning, and his wife was somewhat antagonistic, and Job said, "Stop. Shall I only receive blessings from God, or should I also accept the fact that God can give me stuff I don't necessarily like? Why is it that I should only accept when God gives me good things?" Now that seems really pious. It seems really good. And as you enter into Job chapter 3 in this conversation with his friends, 3 friends come to visit him. For 7 days they don't say a word. They just sit with him. And then Job starts unloading, and then his friends have something to say. And we begin to question, or we begin to see in Job that though he has some theological truths that he's holding, this experience is challenging the very basic structure of them. It's one thing to believe something, and it's another to put that into practice. So let's just walk through this conversation they have. And the conversation between Job and his 3 friends literally lasts 29 chapters in our scriptures. So we're going to bounce through them very quickly. In Job chapter 3, Job said something similar to what Gene shared with us earlier. At verse 11, he says, "Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, who built for themselves places now lying in ruins, with rulers who had gold, who filled their houses with silver." He's basically looking and wondering about the impossible. Why can't we go back in history, blot out the day that I was born, or change the facts of my life in some way so that I had died while being born, and then today I would be like the rest of the dead people that had kings and palaces and mansions and gold and silver. They'd all be dead, but at least they aren't alive and suffering like I am. There's this deep sense in which I am so uncomfortable, I'm so miserable. I wish that I could go back in history and just be dead. Well, that was just enough fuel for Job's three friends to stop being extraordinarily comforting by just sitting with him and start offering a bunch of unsolicited advice. Job chapters 4 and 5 is the response to Job's first words by the friend Eliphaz the Temanite. Eliphaz starts off in a very gentle tone. And what you will see very quickly in his words is a basic theological premise. It's shown to us most clearly in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 4. Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Think about these words in the mind of Job, who is suffering excruciatingly. And the friend, after 7 days of silence, and you now finally opening your mouth and whining a little that it's so bad, says to you, as far as I can tell in life, when bad things happen, it's because you deserve it. So, Job, what's going on? What have you done wrong? See, he's not really operating outside of his basic theological premise. If you're righteous, you will be blessed. If you have done evil, you will be cursed. And if you are righteous for a long period of time and then you are blessed as a result, and then suddenly you start doing evil things or you have an evil something in your life, you will experience a curse for it. So Eliphaz the Temanite just looks at Job and says, so what'd you do wrong? What is your sin? Righteousness equals blessing. Evil equals curse. And so he's even so presumptuous in chapter 5 and verse 1 to say, to which one of the holy ones will you now turn? Almost accusing Job of having turned from God and now worshiping idols or turning to some other power source. And in verse 8, he's so presumptuous as to say, but if it were I would appeal to God and would lay my cause before him. I mean, here's a guy who is suffering beyond measure, and a friend says, maybe you should give up all the garbage that you're involved in and pray to God. Well, who says he hadn't? Who says he hadn't been praying to God? Who says he had filled with evil? But this was the basic premise. End of chapter 5, Eliphaz says, we have examined this, and it is true. So hear it and apply it to yourself. Ouch. Well, in chapter 6 and 7, Job then refutes what has been foisted upon him. In chapter 6 and 7, he defends his integrity and basically says, look, I will stand by my integrity. You show me what you think I have done wrong for your theology to make any sense. Chapter 6, verse 8, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut me off. Then I would still have this consolation, my joy in unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One. Basically saying, I wish God would just do me in. At least then I could die with the knowledge that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I hadn't given up this faint bit of hope that I'm clinging to, which I call my integrity. And he attacks his friends in return in verse 14. A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as streams that overflow when darkened by thawing ice and swollen with melting snow, but that cease to flow in the dry season and in the heat vanish from their channels. These guys are so eloquent. We've lost some of that, haven't we? If someone says something we don't like, we probably just look at them and say, you stink. You're stupid. But he says, oh, my friends are as undependable as intermittent streams that are swollen in spring and dry in summer. Thanks for nothing. In chapter 11, Zophar is the next one to speak. And he's angry. At least he comes across much more caustic. You fool, he basically says to Job. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce men to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock? You say to God, my beliefs are flawless, and I am pure in your sight. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has two sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. So Job defends his integrity, and the second friend jumps in. Remember now the condition of Job's body and what he's experiencing. The second friend jumps in and says, you fool, I wish God would come down and smack you upside the head and teach you a lesson so that you could learn to be righteous like me, who is experiencing much blessing compared to you. You're so sinful, God doesn't even remember all your sin. Wow! What a word from a friend. What's the principle? Righteousness equals blessing, evil equals curse. If you're being cursed, if you're suffering, obviously you've done something wrong, and you need to figure out what it is and confess it. In Job chapters 12, 13, and 14, Job responds again. Doubtless, you are the people. This is just pure sarcasm. Doubtless, you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know all these things? See, the idea here is that wisdom, this understanding of how the world worked and how God related to people, it was a tradition. It was passed on one generation to the next. And this was the tradition that was passed on. If you are righteous, you will be blessed. If you are evil, you will be cursed. And now Job looks at his friends and says, obviously you're the only ones that are wise. And when you die, wisdom will be gone. And then defends himself. Look, I'm not stupid. I get what you're saying. I agree with you in principle that generally speaking, when you are righteous, it will be better for you on earth than if you are cursed. But the fact is that reality is not showing that to be true right now, and I don't know how to deal with it. And that's Job's argument over and over and over again. And in chapters 12, 13, and 14, he makes this statement to them. Essentially, listen, you admit, friends of mine, this is Job talking, you admit that we as humans are imperfect. None of us can stand before God and say, I am perfect and don't deserve to be cursed. So then, if that's the case, what makes you guys so much more righteous than me that I should be suffering like this while you guys should be perfectly healthy telling me that I'm doing something wrong? What's the big difference? Job says, I can't compute this. Of course I'm a sinner. Of course I can't stand before a holy God and defend myself. But neither can you. So why am I suffering like this and you are not? 12, 13, and 14 of Job. Now we get to chapter 15. And Eliphaz speaks again and simply says, so you're saying that all this righteous stuff is just a waste of time? You're wrong. Would a wise man answer with empty notions or fill his belly with the hot east wind, basically calling Job an airbag? Would he argue with useless words, with speeches that have no value? But you even undermine piety and hinder devotion to God. So his response, you're wrong. If you were righteous, you would be blessed. If you're evil, which you obviously are, you will be cursed. What have you done wrong? Job doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. So in chapter 16, Job looks at them and says, I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. You guys stink at helping people. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you? What a great sentence. What ails you that you keep on arguing? Are you have some kind of sickness, or why are you still talking? I also could speak like you if you were in my place. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you. But my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. Let's face it, if someone is suffering, any one of us could go there and point out all the wrong that they've done. What is that going to help? Job said, if you were in my place, I would actually offer you some encouragement. At the end of chapter 17, he says, if the only hope I have is for the grave, if the only hope I hope for is the grave, if I spread out my bed in darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, my mother or my sister, where then is my hope? Who can see any hope from me? Will it go down to the gates of death? Will we descend together into the dust? Essentially, if you get into the text a little more, you see that Job is starting to change his thought pattern a little bit. He's saying, hope is gone in a sense, but that doesn't mean he has lost faith. He has not lost trust that God will work this out better. Gus Conkle, who many of you know well, writes this about this section. False hope is the bedeviling curse the friends have repeatedly tried to foist on Job. He will have none of it. He's not going to cling to their false hope that they're offering. Hopelessness for his life was not faithlessness, as his friends had presumed. Job does have faith. God is his friend, his advocate, his witness, and Job needs nothing more. That is the only hope he can cling to. There's an old saying that says, if you lose money, you lose a lot. If you lose friends, you lose more. If you lose hope, you lose everything. And Job has not lost hope in the sense that he has no hope for anything. He has no hope for himself, but he continues to trust God and question what God is up to. And we're not going to spend more time unwrapping 18, 19, all the way to 31. This argument doesn't change a whole lot. His friends just keep hammering away with the same argument. Job, you've done something wrong. Find out what you've done wrong and repent it to God, and all of this will be better. Job, you've done something wrong. You can say what you want, you can think what you want, you can shake your fist at the sky, but this isn't God's problem, it's your problem, Job. You've done something wrong. Job's tune changes a little bit, though. In the beginning, the only thing you heard from Job was, oh, that I could just be dead. Interesting words. If you get to Job chapter 19, verse 25, Job utters these words. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. That's a subtle change. Suddenly Job is starting to indicate that maybe he is putting faith in something even in his misery. Chapter 26 and verse 14, Job has described the works of God, and he says, and these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. He's talking about God's majesty in creation. He says, that's just a hint of what God can do. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? Job 27. No, I'm going to leave that one. Job works to maintain his integrity, but at the same time he feels his life is unjust and he doesn't know what God is up to. It's his theology versus what he sees to be true. Theology that says, if you're righteous, you'll be blessed. If you are evil, you will be cursed. And the reality that Job is looking at and seeing, well, wait a minute, I am righteous and I'm being cursed. What's going on? He's not suggesting that God doesn't know what he's doing, but he is starting to edge toward a very fine line and questioning whether God is completely just. Maybe he's venting more than he's really believing that God could be unjust, but he's certainly venturing into some very strong talk. Next week, we'll hear from a man named Elihu, a fourth friend, who adds something a little new to this discussion. The week after that, we'll hear from God himself. That should be enlightening. And then after that, we'll hear Job again after he has heard from God very directly. But as we look at this conversation, what are some truths then that we need to incorporate into our thinking as we struggle with this very same question? Yeah, in general, the righteous should be blessed and the evil ones should be cursed. What up with reality? Some truths for you. True statements, too narrowly applied, can be false, harmful, and hurtful. True statements, too narrowly applied, can be false, harmful, and hurtful. In a sense, what the friends were saying was entirely true. They just applied it to too narrow a scope. Think of it. As I look around me, and I've made these comments myself, and I believe them to be perfectly true, when we live according to God's pattern laid out before us, when we live according to the design with which He has created us, life is better. When we live according to the design He has created us with, our marriages stay together. Our families become foundational. We have less dysfunction. We have happier homes in general. Parents are better parents. Children are more content children. Children are more content children. There's a certain level of consistency and there's a certain level of order that takes place. And as that building block called the family begins to take root in society, in a very general way, a good mom and a good dad and a healthy home and people that know how to work the way God has given them work to do, economic prosperity in a general way follows. And the Proverbs play out. We are working according to God's plan. I will work hard. I will work for other people. I will be humble and serve, and I will do these things. Then, generally speaking, established homes, not perfect ones, but generally speaking, established homes and economic prosperity and viability, all of those things tend to come together. And that's the Job of chapters 1 and 2, of the introduction, I should say. Job of the introduction, being righteous, doing what God desired of him, experiencing some prosperity in a big, happy, healthy family, and so on and so forth. That's a general truth. And the Proverbs point to it over and over and over again. But guess what? It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you do exactly what you believe God is calling you to do, and you're working hard at your marriage, and you're working hard to be the kind of parent that you're supposed to be, and you're working hard at having a good job and having a career, and the bottom falls out. That happens too. That is life. That is reality. And your marriage falls apart, and your family's dysfunctional, and your kids are off the deep end, and you lost your job, and you're losing your home, and you can't keep up with the payments. This happens. So what then? What happened to the general truth that when I live according to God's design for me, it goes well? What happened to that general truth? That's where Job is. What now? How do I understand God in this? And his friends could do nothing more than to take one true statement that when you are righteous in general it will go well for you, and hammer him with it over and over and over again. And it was harmful, it was hurtful, and it was false. Even though generally speaking, they had a good point. True statements like this one, too narrowly applied, can be false, harmful, and hurtful. Caveat, I'm not talking about theological compromise. Ooh, my theology doesn't work very well in this situation, so I'm going to change what the Bible says and make it fit. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about taking exactly what the Bible says and applying it appropriately. And there are many of inappropriate ways to apply biblical truths. I'll give you an example from my history. I grew up in a Mennonite culture whose one of their main theological tenets is pacifism. Turn the other cheek. So I've challenged people at times, and I've had this discussion. It's a difficult issue. Because Jesus very clearly talked about being a peacemaker. Very clearly said if your enemy strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. If he, there is that notion and this idea of being loving and always having a loving response. So I've pushed the issue at times, and I said, so you create the most ridiculous scenario to ferret out what you really believe and what you don't. And I've asked my own family members, so if somebody walked into your house and started abusing and attacking your family, what would you do? And you know what they all respond to a person? Oh, I'd take care of business, don't get me wrong. And I question that a little. I say, well, wait a minute. You believe this, but you apply it in this situation. You can't apply it in this situation, or you won't at least. One of two things is wrong. Either your reality is messed up, or your theology is messed up. But if you can't practice your theology in reality, you have a problem. And most often, we can't change our reality if we're suffering. The psalmist in Psalm 73 reflects on this exact challenge. This is what the wicked are like, he writes. Always carefree, they increase in wealth. Surely in vain have I kept my heart pure. In vain have I washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been plagued. I have been punished every morning. If I have said, I will speak thus, I would have betrayed your children. When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me. In other words, it must have been a waste of time that I tried to follow God's ways because my life stinks and the evil people are getting wealthy and having a great life. What do? Well, the friends too narrowly applied a biblical truth. Number 2, suffering and prosperity are not distributed in the world in proportion to the evil or good that a person does. That's a mouthful. Suffering and